All right, everyone. Thanks so much for showing up to Huddle. And as you might have guessed, we are going to almost repeat what we did last week because I think all of us, hold on, I got music on in the background. Uh, uh, I think all the brokers are having a similar experience as well as all the agents in that our understanding of this process is getting better, but is certainly not to the level that we need it to be. And there are a lot of questions that remain. And before we begin, we are taking very seriously the request to create, a flow chart, if you will. And we do have a first draft, but not a draft that is probably ready for prime time. But we are going to repeat all that today and make sure everybody has a really good understanding of what's going on. And by the way, use chat as much as you can, and we'll try to answer every single question today. And I am joined here with Mark. Mark and I are going to take the lead and guide everyone through this. So before we begin, Craig says, where is the showing agreement located? What is the official name of the form and cannot locate it in dot loop? Craig, I'm assuming you're on the Wasatch back and you are referring to the Park City MLS showing agreement. And that showing agreement has been intentionally left off our dot loop as we prefer that you don't use it. Mark, is that the correct answer for the
Yeah,
Wasatch?
it actually does not exist. The only showing agreement I'm aware of that's in circulation promulgated by anyone in Utah is the or any MLS or the state or UAR is the Washington County showing agreement. Washington County MLS board released their version. Now, what happened is Park City announced that they were going to license that agreement from Washington County and create their own, but those negotiations, if you will, fell through. So Park City does not currently have, the Wasatch Back does not currently have a showing agreement. I understand they may be drafting one, but there is not a showing agreement available for either the front or back right now. The only one that exists is Washington County.
Okay.
Mark, I talked to Bob Bemis as well at the Park City Board, and he said that the Forums Committee got so much pushback from brokers who did not want a showing agreement up here that they have been told not to draft it. So they took the cue from them, and they're encouraging all of our members to actually use a agency agreement, the buyer broker agreement, and just limit it to the property or the time or the day or whatever, so that we still have agency with them. The problem with the showing agreement is somebody could actually take a buyer out, show them 10 properties or spend 10 days with them while they're here in town. And then they say, well, thank you very much for showing me all these properties. I'm going to go directly to the listing broker and negotiate a better deal on their own. And you would not be protected because the procuring cause is completely gone. So all the brokers up here said, we don't want
Well, Kevin, that is very much music to my ears because
it.
I'm of the camp that we have a buyer broker agreement. We have which is effectively our showing agreement. It's been in use for years and years and years. It's not broken. There's no reason to fix it.
And it
That's
has a protection clause for the properties that they end up showing them, so they are protected by contract. So they
right.
can't do an end run around you.
And it's also very flexible, as Kevin mentioned, in terms of scope, whether that scope be in duration or in the scope of the number of properties that it pertains to. So it's very easy to use and to narrow it down to a 1 day period or to one or two properties period. So I'm glad we're going that route. And that was certainly the route that the UAR chose to go as well. We considered at the Forms Committee level, we considered drafting a showing agreement and opted for all the reasons Kevin has identified not to do so. So, all right. Um, I guess we'll jump right into some scenarios. As Mike mentioned, we were going to kind of rehash. Last week, we introduced the brokerage fee contingency addendum, and we'll get into that a little bit here in a second. And we also introduced a real estate brokerage compensation addendum to the REPC. Both of those are addenda to the REPC. Um, And we talked a little bit about how to use them, but as Mike mentioned, I think we kind of recap with some specific scenarios. And I'll jump into one scenario here real quick in a second. And I think that will lead to kind of some questions that you all have. And I'll ask the brokers that are on. I know Mike and Kevin are on. I can't see all the brokers, but and each of the agents, if there are scenarios that you're running into that kind of feed off this first scenario we're going to go through, either put your questions in the chat or raise your hand and let's get them out there. But here's the first, and before I get in the first scenario, let me hit real quick. I want to remind everybody on buyer agent compensation. Remember this form we talked about in all the trainings? Before we get into this, I think before we get into the scenarios, it's really instructive to remember there's only three ways a buyer agent can be paid, right? The buyer agent can be paid directly in the BBA, directly by the buyer as a function of their buyer broker agreement. That's option one. Option two is the buyer's agent can be paid via a brokerage compensation agreement between the seller's brokerage and the buyer's brokerage. Number three, the buyer's agent can be paid via the REPC. Okay, those are the only three written agreements that will allow a buyer's agent to be paid. We do not have the MLS any longer. Some of this is review, but I think it's important to start there for everyone. We don't have the MLS any longer, so we have to have a written agreement that provides for a buyer agent compensation. So with that understanding, let's jump into the first scenario. We've got a buyer agent who wants to submit an offer. Okay, I'm the buyer agent. And with this particular offer, I've already called the listing agent. And I've said, listing agent, what has your seller authorized you to communicate in terms of compensation available to a buyer's brokerage? And that listing brokerage may say, let's just say they've authorized me to communicate up to 3% is available to a buyer's brokerage. And to that, I may say, great, I am looking at submitting an offer here in the next few hours. I will send you over a compensation agreement, a real estate brokerage compensation agreement that will be our agreement between the brokerages on that 3%. Because I have a BBA that requires my buyer to pay 3%. So everything lines up. I'm going to send you over a brokerage compensation agreement. Please sign it and return it to me, and that way we'll have that for my offer. So you'd hang up and send over the real estate brokerage compensation agreement. And in section 3 of that agreement, we clarify, we represent that we have a BBA with our buyer that requires the buyer to pay 3% to us. This is the scenario I'm using here. And that listing agent just said that his seller has authorized him to offer up to 3%. So we're going to go ahead and put 3% in section 4. So we have perfect alignment there. The seller is offering to pay up to 3. My BBA requires my buyer to pay 3. We have good alignment there. So in section 5, we're going to say, it says if the REPC also provides for seller's payment of a buyer's brokerage fee, well, we're going to say the REPC will govern if the buyer and seller get into discussions over compensation in the REPC, we'll let the REPC govern. But for all intents and purposes, as of right now, this real estate brokerage compensation fee will govern broker to broker compensation. Okay, so I have that. I've sent that over. And let's say I receive it back, and now I have a fully signed, and Kevin has signed, or your broker has signed on behalf of the buyer's brokerage, and you have a fully executed real estate brokerage compensation agreement. Now we go to our offer, and we don't need to worry about compensation in the offer at this point because we have a perfect alignment. Remember, the 3 and 3 line up in my scenario. And so we can simply submit our REPC, our offer. And in section 4.3E, we would either leave it blank, which is perfectly fine, or if you don't like to leave blanks in a REPC, I know many people don't, I would simply write N/A on each line, not applicable, and submit the REPC without any other addenda related to compensation. You don't need a real estate brokerage fee contingency addendum because that's already established and signed, fully executed, remember. So you would submit your REPC as you've always done. That is a very straightforward, clean way if you have a fully executed brokerage compensation agreement that fully satisfies your buyer's obligation in the BBA. Okay. Let's put a little twist on that scenario and say, I sent over my brokerage fee compensation agreement. and it was fully aligned and everything looks good. We're 3 and 3, but it's not signed. And my buyer says, I really love this house. Let's get the REPC in. Well, there you would submit the same REPC, right? But you don't have a fully executed compensation agreement. You'd submit the same REPC, but then along with the REPC, you'd also want to submit the brokerage fee contingency addendum, right? Because you don't have a fully executed agreement. So you'd want to say that the offer is contingent upon the two brokerages, buyers and sellers brokerage, executing a broker to broker compensation agreement no later than, and there's a blank in there in that addendum, right? My recommendation would be to put the seller disclosure deadline as the date. That way, you have to reach a brokerage compensation agreement and remove that contingency prior to the seller disclosure deadline before you move forward with due diligence or any. It's early enough in the process so that we can get the broker fee agreement out of the way and move forward, or not get it out of the way, and then the offer is the offer never becomes valid, right?
Mark, this could also read so many days following acceptance, right? If you wanted to get it just like 2 or 3 days
Absolutely.
after acceptance rather than tying it to a seller disclosure deadline. You
It
don't
can
want to
be
get too far
anything
down
you
a
want.
contract without getting compensation set. Otherwise, it just hangs out there like a thorn that never goes away.
Yep, you're exactly right, Kevin. And I sat there and tried to figure out what do I hinge it to, and I decided flexibility was the best option here. And you can decide; it can be really anything. It doesn't have to be hinged to a deadline. But this brokerage fee contingency addendum should be thought of as a companion to a broker compensation agreement, meaning you'll use it if you are wanting to use a brokerage fee compensation agreement as part of your offer, but don't have it fully executed yet. So it's a companion agreement to the real estate brokerage compensation agreement is a good way to think about it.
Um,
I'm sure we have questions so far. Let's see if
yeah,
we have.
there's a couple in here. I think I really like Kylie's question, but I do want to ask everybody, how is using this document going thus far? I think I think that I and Peter's question does lead to confusion. The core of Peter's question is leading
Yeah,
people to a lot of confusion. Remember, we are not saying that one of these options is better than the other. What we are doing is we are presenting multiple options to help you with different scenarios. Okay.
yeah,
And so the scenario that we just presented you is a conversation that you may have had a couple days prior to your anticipated, writing your offer. You have a little bit of time, and you would rather, in some cases, negotiate your commission before you submit your offer than not.
So your
Um,
commission doesn't turn into one of the components of the offer, and your commission gets negotiated away along with the buyer and seller arguing over price and other terms.
yeah. And Peter, we'll get to your question and an example of that here in a second. We do have these three options. Utah, as I mentioned in a number of our trainings now, Utah could have very easily decided that we were not going to allow for broker to broker compensation agreements in our forms. But that was not prohibited by the NAR settlement. So Utah took the position for now, while it's not prohibited, we're going to allow broker to broker compensation. And that just gives you one more avenue to secure buyer agent compensation. And you may decide that you want to do all of your compensation negotiation in the REPC. And that's up to you. That is another option. But we're just presenting this as one option.
Yeah. And Peter, you said I had a listing agent who said they want it in the offer. They want to see the offer first. Yeah, I think you're going to get that comment, and there's no reason to shove the brokerage compensation agreement down their throat.
Absolutely not. No, you're going to get some listing agents that'll sign it and some that will object to it and just say, put it in the offer. I don't want to deal with it. And that's fine. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and there's no, yeah, I don't think you should feel anxiety one way or the other. You know, here
Yeah.
just a couple days ago, I sat down with an agent to kind of walk through this exact problem, and they had already agreed ahead of time to sign a brokerage compensation agreement, and the commission was worked out, and it was just done, and it wasn't a question, right? And so, in those instances, I do think it's best for you to get the brokerage compensation signed ahead of time. I think it sort of takes that thing off the table. It's one less thing to negotiate.
If it's clean and easy, like the scenario that I described, where you have a 3% BBA and the seller is offering up to 3%, that's clean and easy, right? That makes sense to go ahead and try to have that signed before you submit your offer if you can. And if it's not signed, to use the contingency fee addendum. Now, what if when I called that seller, what if that seller said, my seller's agent, I'm sorry. What if the seller's agent said, my seller's authorized me to communicate up to 2%, and I have a BBA that says 3%? Well, this is my personal opinion. The forms will allow for you to enter into a brokerage compensation agreement and then negotiate that 1% in the REPC. My personal opinion is don't use the brokerage compensation agreement in that scenario, and just put all the compensation in the REPC, kind of like Peter's talking about. It might tend to confuse the buyer and seller when you have compensation and a compensation agreement, and then you have more compensation or additional compensation in the REPC. I would advise in that scenario where you don't have a match between what the buyer's obligated to pay in a BBA and what the seller's offering. I would put it all in the REPC at that point.
Yeah, so Mark, one of the problems that we've seen is we've had people who have actually got a buyer broker compensation or brokerage compensation agreement signed for 3%, and then they also put 3% in the REPC. So it basically says the seller's brokerage is going to pay 3%, but then it also says that the listing brokerage is going to pay the 3%, but then the seller in the REPC is also going to pay 3% to the buyer's brokerage. Uh,
Right. And,
we
and
know that
what
that's only 3%, but it could be misconstrued. But it should be zero in the REPC, shouldn't it? If we already have the agreement signed.
It should be NA in the REPC if we
NA.
already. It
Yep.
can be zero as well, but I think best
NA would be
practices would
better.
be NA or blank. Yes, you shouldn't have 3% in both spots. Now, what would technically happen in that scenario is, remember, there's a in my example there was a 3% BBA. The seller was offering 3, so in our real estate brokerage compensation agreement we had 3 and 3, and then I checked the first box in 5, section 5. The REPC shall govern if the REPC also provides for payment of a buyer's brokerage fee. Well, in that instance, the real estate brokerage compensation agreement would become null and void. We'd look to the REPC, and in Kevin's scenario, that it was still 3%. So it really doesn't matter where the compensation is. Again, don't be um, hesitant to use either one of these methods, because they both work. But if you're filling it in both spots, it's going to be confusing to your seller. Um, so
The
just
buyer.
or the buyer, I would recommend dealing with compensation in one spot if you can.
Okay. Peter, take it away, and then Kylie, we're gonna jump on your question.
Hey, what's going on? Hey, so I did Kevin's point. If there is a brokerage fee being offered to a buyer's agent, and you don't really inquire with the listing agent, you just build it in the REPC at 3%. I had physically had another agent today from a different company tell me that that's misconstrued, and we'd be having to pay 6% because we have the brokerage fee that we've agreed from the seller to pay 3, and then they built it in the REPC at 3. And she was telling me that would be construed as 6%, being paid 6%. Is that's not correct, right?
Well, I mean, to be fair to her, anybody can construe anything.
Well, she said she spoke to her legal department and that's what they told her.
What compensation agreement was it?
So
Was it
they
the
had,
UAR form?
oh, I didn't even inquire in regards to what they had signed on their end because I
If
was
it's the
going to build in the
UAR form,
3% and
then
REPC.
if it's the UAR form, that's the reason we advised against using that form. The UAR form is problematic. I would argue that that's probably accurate if they use the UIR form.
Okay.
That locks the seller listing brokerage into paying 3%, and then in the REPSI you said the seller is going to pay 3%.
Right.
Arguably, that's a 6%. That's the problem with the UIR form, and that's why we said don't use it.
Right. Right. Okay.
Okay, let's jump on Kylie's question. And here's her question for those who can't read. I went to forums discussion of the Park City Board today, and the instructor said that we cannot amend a buyer broker agreement up. The reason that there is no consideration on the buyer's side if you amend it up. What are your thoughts? So we have talked about amending it down. And she is saying she has heard that we cannot amend it upwards. What say you?
Yeah, there's a lot of commentary in the press right now about this, whether or not we should be amending upwards. There's certainly nothing that prohibits amending upwards in the NAR settlement. It just says you can only receive as the buyer's brokers the amount set forth in the agreement. You can't receive more. Amending
I
up.
think what you were saying is that it's not in the buyer's interest to amend it up.
Well,
It's
that's
not,
exactly right. It's going to
yeah,
be a difficult conversation with your buyer if you're asking for more than you've contracted with. Obviously, the buyer is going to say, "Wait a minute, if there's money on the table, I'm going to want to somehow have that used to my advantage in more instances than not." So it's a very difficult conversation to have.
Yeah.
Amending words.
I think it was the specific example is like Claim is offering 4% right now to buyer's agents.
mhm.
But most of us, I can't imagine, have a 4% buyer broker agreement or will. So in that case, but again, yeah, is it beneficial to the buyer to say, yeah, we'll only take 3 and then 1% off the purchase price, or however that goes. But
Right.
it's that's when it starts to come up, is in those specific situations.
Yeah,
Yes.
Kylie, I
And
think
to
the
be
answer to that
clear,
is
claim is only offering the
yeah,
4% on 2 residences, just to be clear.
right. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, but yes.
I,
I think the buyer may think that they're going to get some sort of a discount if you only get three, but that's not the case. They're offering it as a bonus for buyers agents to bring their buyers out there. If the buyer doesn't agree to amend it up, you just lose it out. They don't get any benefit at all, and that's the way to explain it to them.
Yeah, I would also say this would I think this could apply frequently. I mean, how many builders in Utah are offering any kind of incentive or bonus, or I mean, that's not uncommon.
Yeah.
And I don't think what we're doing with our buyer broker agreements can accommodate that
Well, and
if you can't go up.
they used an example of like in a buyer broker agreement having it be, for a already built home 3%, but for a new build, it's 4% or whatever to potentially capture that. It was just things were being thrown out there, but it was just an interesting thing that came up.
yeah, there's a good bit of commentary right now in the industry about that and whether or not you can amend up. One professor out of, I think it was New York, came out and said that violates the NAR settlement agreement. I disagree with that. I don't think it violates the agreement. I think contracting parties are free to amend their agreements if they're fully informed and decide to make that decision. Okay. Anything left in the chat, Mike?
No, Rachel says commissions are fully negotiable. Upwards is included in that. I think we all agree with you, Rachel. I think we're
She
all,
gets extra credit for that answer.
it is, that is, I'm thinking like maybe 500 bonus points be added
That's
to
good. Kind of like whose line is it? Whose line is it anyway? Meaningless bonus points.
yeah.
All right, let's jump over and walk through a scenario real quick, and I'm sure this will raise some questions as well. Let's walk through a scenario where either the listing agent has said, "I'm not interested in signing a brokerage compensation agreement." Put it in your offer, or maybe there's not alignment between what your BBA says and what the seller's offering. If your BBA says 3% and the seller's offering up to 2%. well, I'm not going to mess with a brokerage fee compensation agreement. I'm just going to put it all in the rep C and have my seller or my buyer, excuse me, ask for the full 3% because that's what they're obligated to me for. So, first document, I'm going to submit an offer, and this is a scenario, Peter, your question. This is where I'm going to put all compensation into the rep C. And as you know, by now, section 4.3E has been revised to allow for compensation directly in the rep C. And so this is where we're going to have our buyer is going to ask the seller to pay, in my scenario, that 3% that I have in my BBA. And so we would fill in 3% in section 4.3E of the rep C. Okay. And now, as of right now, this is just a blanket request by your buyer that says, seller, please, I'd like for you to pay my buyer's brokerage in the amount that I've agreed to them. There's no verification. There's no proof that amount has actually been agreed to in a BBA. There's nothing along those lines. And so what we've seen a number of listing agents and listing brokerages say, okay, you're asking my seller to pay that. Send me a copy of your BBA. Well, that's one, inappropriate. It would be a breach of your fiduciary duty to your buyer as a buyer's agent to send that over to the listing agent. But more importantly, what we've done is as we disclosed or unveiled last week, we've come up with kind of a solution to this in the real estate brokerage compensation addendum. So with your offer, with your rep C, where you're asking the seller to pay 3%, you would send over a copy of the real estate brokerage compensation addendum. And what this does in section 1, it's an affirmative representation that you do in fact have a BBA that requires your buyer, or that requires the buyer, to pay 3% to the buyer's brokerage. And in section 2, it's an affirmative obligation or acknowledgement by the buyer that prior to settlement, they'll deliver a copy of their BBA over to the title company. So the title company can confirm that the 3% that you've requested in the rep C in 4.3E lines up with a 3% figure in the BBA. If for some reason the title company got a copy of the BBA and it was only for 2%, well, the language in this addendum says that the title company is only going to pay the 2% that is in the BBA, and the seller would retain that 1% additional that they were offering. And section 3 of this agreement is just a clarification, because you remember in 4.3E of the rep C, it says that this payment, the 3% request from buyer to seller, is in addition to any other compensation agreed to by seller's brokerage to buyer's brokerage. That would be a brokerage fee agreement, right? We're clarifying because we're in this example, we're putting all compensation in the rep C. So we're clarifying here in section 3 of the brokerage compensation addendum that there is no additional compensation agreed to by the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage. And therefore, the total compensation payable at closing by the seller to the buyer's brokerage equals, and then again, this would be the 3%, right? No compensation anywhere but in the rep C, and it's in 4.3E, and then in this addendum, we've established that I have a BBA. I'll turn it over to the title company, and the total compensation is 3%. So all the compensation is dealt with in the context of the rep C, no broker-to-broker compensation agreement in this particular example. And this is a scenario that a lot of agents are leaning towards or have indicated a preference for. You know, when we start talking about the brokerage compensation agreement, a lot of agents say, well, why don't we just put it all in the rep C? And a lot of listing agents that we've heard are saying, put your offer in the rep C. We're not going to sign a broker-to-broker compensation agreement. That's all fine. And now you know exactly how to do that. What has anybody done this? Does anybody have questions about this? Anybody have real life stories of something that went wrong, something that went right?
In this scenario, I actually do have a couple people that have posed a similar question. So that addendum essentially says what you just said is that they have to provide a copy of their BBA to the title company, which confirms the amount written in the REPSI. Kind of going back to Kylie's question, is there anything preventing an agent from negotiating 2.5% in a REPSI, but having only negotiated, say, 2% in their BBA? Is there anything preventing them from being under contract, adjusting their BBA to 2.5% well after the fact? And is that that was presented twice to me. Like people can just play that game and still get paid. Um,
The title company will only be paying whatever set forth in the REPSI. I mean, if the buyer and not the REPSI, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
BBA, the cap is the BBA. So if the document they provide to the title company has two in it, the title company is only going to pay two, assuming that the seller has agreed to pay the two.
yeah.
Um, it's up to the buyer and the buyer's brokerage to negotiate that amount. And if the buyer is willing to amend the agreement upwards, then they can amend it upwards. But the title company is going to be limited to paying whatever is ultimately reflected in that BBA.
Yeah, and I think the short of that is it's if we use that addendum, it's none of our business, right? So if they successfully negotiate the amount in their BBA to reflect what's in the purchase contract, how they get there is however they get there, and we don't need to necessarily concern ourselves with that.
Yeah, originally, as these concepts were being drafted into the agreements, originally the thought was this is not a listing brokerage's issue or problem. This is for the buyer. The buyer brokerage is the entity that has the limitation on it for what it is can accept in a transaction. And if they accepted more than is in their BBA, that's their violation to deal with if it comes up.
Yeah.
As we progressed, we realized that a listing brokerage probably has or does have a fiduciary duty to its seller to make sure that the seller is not obligating itself to pay too much. So that's kind of the reason for in both the brokerage compensation agreement and now in the REPSI via this addendum that we have this check and balance sort of mechanism so that make sure the seller's not paying too much, make sure the buyer's not receiving too much. And because what would happen is ultimately it would come down to a post-closing fight over that 0.5% or that 1% that was overpaid. And the seller is going to look to the listing agent and say, well, why didn't you protect me in this? Why did you create a scenario where I paid an extra point?
Yeah.
Hey,
So now
Mark, what?
we've solved all that with
Yeah.
this addendum.
Another question that's come up is, hey, I'm the listing agent. Um, the buyer broker agreement and what's been negotiated in the REPSI is 2%. And I'm contracted for 6% total commission. So the seller's now only paying 5. Who gets the extra percent? Do I get it?
The
No,
seller
it
gets
goes
it.
to the seller. Let's just
Seller
make
gets
that
it.
clear right now. Yeah, it's that's spelled out in the new listing agreement and the addendum to the listing agreement that there's 3% offered to the listing brokerage, X to the buyer, but if it's negotiated differently, that's all the seller pays.
Yeah, remember in the old days, we had our brokerage fee under the listing agreement was a total compensation,
Yeah.
right? That amount went to the listing brokerage and then was split, or a portion was allocated to the buyer's brokerage. Now our listing agreement has only the listing fee.
Right.
In section 2.1 of our listing agreement is only the list side. So that extra point does not go to the listing brokerage. It goes to the seller,
Yeah.
which
Okay.
is where it should be. Savings should accrue to the seller.
There you
Yeah,
go.
that's who we represent.
That's right.
All right, we got some questions to burn through here. Kimberly says, under contract, and I represent the buyer, and the seller is paying 2.5% BBC. My buyer knows he needs to pay the other half percent. Still in due diligence period. Best way to see if we can still get the seller to pay that other half percent. Um, So after the fact, you're under contract and you're trying to extract 0.5% from the seller for your fee because you have negotiated 3%. What say you, Mark?
Well, but you're already under contract and there wasn't a request before we had acceptance, if I'm understanding that correctly, right?
Right. There was not a request because we were in multiple offer situation. It was competitive. It wouldn't have been smart to do that.
Right. Well, I mean, you're left with just either a simple request of the seller at this point, which would likely be denied, um, or you're going to be collecting it from your buyer. I mean,
And
that's
the buyer would have to actually make the objection to during due diligence to the 2.5, and that they're having to pay it, and the buyer would have to make that request on your behalf.
Yeah.
right.
So would
Yeah,
it,
be an addendum to the REPC.
yeah, we do an addendum to the REPC, not a broker to broker anything. This is before the new REPC came out. So we'd used an addendum to get the brokerage payment addendum in
Okay.
there.
Yes, and no, it would not be a broker to broker situation. You'd be asking the seller directly via an addendum to the REPC to make up that extra half point. The
Okay.
buyer, the buyer would be asking, I should say. Sorry.
Got it. Thanks.
But I guess the question is, do you do that on a due diligence resolution form?
Ooh, could we do that on a resolution of due diligence?
Good question, huh?
We're going to ask for much repairs, but because we were in this situation, this seller actually wanted to back out. So I told my buyer they're probably not going to want to give much now because they want you to cancel. But could we do it on a resolution of due diligence? That is a good question.
Yes, you can.
So in the field where I can write whatever, I
Yes.
just write seller to pay an additional 0.5% to meet the 3% buyer broker agreement.
The
That
buyer's obligation to their agent.
It's buyer's obligation. So it would just be seller to pay an additional 0.5 or 0.5%, making the seller's total obligation 3%.
Reason
okay.
being, the buyer's accepting the property and its condition. The seller won't make the repairs, but if you'll actually cover my fee payment to my agent, then I'll go ahead and accept the property the way it is.
Yep, I love it that way. Thank you. I'm going to do it
Yeah.
that way.
That language that appears in the real estate brokerage payment addendum, the original one that you used there before the REPC included the 4.3E language, that can be cut and paste into, just like we're talking about, either a blank addendum or into a resolution of due diligence.
But if the seller says, I don't want to pay any more commission at this time, can the buyer back out? That doesn't seem fair.
Are you in due diligence or out of due diligence?
In due diligence? That doesn't seem fair because you're asking it later and the seller thinks, oh, he's only paying this much.
Well, the buyer has a free walk during due diligence.
For
For
anything, that just
anything.
doesn't seem fair to me to the seller.
Well, I mean, that's no different than 6 months ago. The buyer could walk for any reason.
Okay. All right. Got
They
it.
could block for the color of paint. They didn't think the paint was pink, but it was pink in daylight and they saw it at night.
Yeah.
Still not fair to the seller. Buyers use it all the time, but it doesn't seem right, but it is.
I've been a seller. I'm sure many of you have. There's lots of things that aren't fair as a seller.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. Craig says, is there a BBA in dot loop which does not have the affiliated business arrangement and wire fraud disclosure formed? These two additional documents do not seem relevant at the early stages of showing property and building a relationship with a buyer.
We've had that question before, and I think, is Joe on? I can't see Joe.
Yes, we are figuring out how to roll those out. The big concern here, guys, is obviously if the client progresses through the transaction, those other two forms will still need to be filled out, right? So if you do any one of those, the buyer broker agreement or the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, both of those also require the affiliated business disclosure and the wire fraud. So
But Joe, they could be put in there separately and both be required forms and
Exactly.
They
Correct.
really need to be put in there separately. I mean, there's I mean, the second form itself has I mean, it's asking for the property address. I mean, it's completely irrelevant at that stage.
There's no argument, Craig. We're just this is a logistical process. That's what we're doing.
Got
We're
it.
just trying to figure out how to parse it out.
Yeah, understood. I mean, I would say that's quite high on a priority list just because, like, how are we supposed to get people under contract signing
Yeah, now
something?
we're having to sign them on it before showings,
I
like you
only say
mentioned
this, I'm
before.
at the end of the day, I almost only focus on buy side. So like I don't have an agreement to use with people I want to go out and show right now.
You got it, Craig. No, it's
All right. No,
you're
we hear
talking.
you.
We're
Thank
talking
you.
hours. We're not talking days.
Beautiful. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, but we do need to have the understanding that those other two forms will be required forms, just so everybody knows.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. If you need to, and this will be completed quickly, but Adobe will, as Madeline says, chop those documents up for you if you need them to. But we should have this fixed pretty quick. Jessica says, I had to use the broker to broker when using a builder's contract because their REPSI didn't correspond to the addendum. Yeah, this does bring up, there's still a few purchase contracts out there that does not have any new additional language. And you are correct, those addendum do not reference it correctly. So broker to broker is a way to get paid in commercial transactions as well as new construction for now.
And the land
And
contract.
REPSI for land as well.
Yeah, thank you. I knew I was missing one. Okay, that's we've got 15 minutes left, and we got through all our questions. Anything else?
You have another scenario, Mark?
We got yeah, I could probably come up with a scenario. I do want to have a plug for probably Rob and Will, since they're not with us today. Those of you in Wasatch Front meeting this week heard a very impassioned plea from Rob regarding social media. But I think his message was well put and should be well taken. There's a lot going on social media right now. I'm not on social media, thankfully, but I know many of you are, and there's a lot of information being spread around that is not accurate. You have to be very careful what you're doing on social media, in terms of from a number of perspectives. I'm going to talk about from learning perspective in the education, and I'm going to ask Joe to talk about what he talked about on the Wasatch Front meeting. But in terms of there's a lot of folks on there that don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the nuances of these forms like we're digging into week in and week out in our sales meetings and our huddles and trainings. So the likelihood of you being confused by trying to follow folks on social media is pretty significant. And I would just caution you to getting involved in too much social media and looking to us and to your brokers and to your leadership team and to one another as we work through this process to understand the forms and the scenarios and the talking points to use with your clients. I can guarantee we're doing it better here at Berkshire Hathaway Utah Properties than anybody's doing it out there. So let's stick together. We'll work through this together, and I can assure you you're going to get the best information right here.
Yeah. I'll just add that the most popular Facebook forum seems to be devolving in many areas, and yeah, let's not participate in the bashing or anger posts that go on there quite often. Let's just steer clear. You could probably read and smile and giggle. I mean, that's fine, you know.
The other thing I'll mention is that was kind of Rob's take. Will's take from this past week was, hey, let's keep the fun in real estate. I'm not going to do it as passionately and as emphatically as Will would. But he was saying, there's a lot of listing agents out there. We're hearing anecdotally, a lot of listing agents are, when buyers agents call up and say, what is your seller offering in terms of buyer brokerage compensation? They're playing games. They're saying, it depends on how good your offer is. What's it going to be? Let's be professional and cordial. We get authorization in the listing agreement from our seller to offer otherwise or communicate that they're willing to offer buyer's brokerages up to a certain amount. Unless your seller tells you otherwise, communicate that in the way that you've been authorized to do. Thank buyers for being interested in your listing. This is an opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity to be frustrated here. There's a lot of opportunity to rise above and be the professionals we are here at Berkshire Hathaway. Be thankful that there's buyers coming to you asking about compensation. They're doing the right thing. Hopefully, our buyers agents are doing that on the flip side. So Will's comment would be to take a moment, be professional, be gracious, and inject some fun into this process as well. Because presumably we all love it. That's why we're here. It's a great business to be in. I know I'm enjoying this. I enjoy every single day. So resonate that, exude that in the marketplace, and it'll come back to you when you're on the other side.
Well, before we go, Mark, Nicole.
No, I don't want to leave. I told you.
I know we're not leaving.
Go ahead.
Nicole asked a great question. If the DOJ's goal is to end broker-to-broker compensation, do you think this change could happen within the year? Wouldn't it be best to adjust for that now rather than waiting for changes? Question mark. Are we taking on more legal risk by continuing broker-to-broker compensation if the DOJ wants it gone?
My crystal ball is probably this, and this is not legal advice. This is really just my thought on how the industry might develop. I think we'll know within the next year whether or not we're going to whether or not broker-to-broker compensation is going to survive. And again, no, I don't think we're taking on additional legal risk here in the next year to be engaged in broker-to-broker comp. It wasn't prohibited under the settlement agreement. A lot of other states are doing the same thing. California is really the only one who's eliminated it, to my knowledge, at this point. But it may be going away. Would that simplify things? I don't know, Peter. Would that be better for someone who's more interested in putting all compensation in the REPSI? Maybe. I think it would simplify things, but it also would probably bring compensation into every single transaction. And does that complicate things? We could debate that all day, probably. I do want Joe to weigh in here and offer his commentary that he offered in the Wasatch Front meeting this week. I thought it was very valuable to hear how participating in social media discussions might create exposure for agents.
Yeah, I mean, I think the summary is, if you send an email, you send a text, you make a comment on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, that is there forever. So you're in the middle of an impassioned transaction. Maybe the agent on the other side is not treating you the way you should be treated. And you go up and you make a complaint on the agent form about how difficult this forms thing is, or you make a disparaging comment about a different brokerage or all that. I will tell you two things. Number one is, even if you go back and delete that comment, somebody's probably taken a screenshot. Somebody's probably recorded something. As we know that we have multiple agents, not real estate agents, agents of law firms, agents of other groups that are interested in continuing lawsuits, and they are monitoring these forums and may be included in those forums as subversive or hidden agents. It's just pretending that they're just an agent just like you. They may even be baiting a conversation. And all they're trying to do is get you to slip up and go tap, 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 make one comment. They take a picture of that. Now your name is associated to that, and they will in the future call out a lawsuit and go back and say, hey, in July of 2024, you said this about this brokerage, and come after you that way. I'll add to that all of you, I'm sure, are huge Homie fans on this call. Love working with Homie. Homie has filed a lawsuit. They filed last Friday in the state of Utah, and they're essentially taking the exact same DOJ lawsuit language and claiming that agents in the state of Utah nationally discriminated against Homie listings because the compensation was not offered the way that it traditionally was. That lawsuit is moving forward. They're going to go try to do everything they can. I happen to know a couple of the early investors in Homie, and I'll tell you right now that they have laid off the majority of their staff, and Homie is essentially taking the leftover capital it still has as a company, and they're applying it to this lawsuit. So their Hail Mary is, we are going to go sue everybody, right? In the lawsuit papers, they actually say we have text messages and emails from agents not of Homey brokerage that indicate that they would not show properties that Homey listed because the compensation was not what it traditionally was. And so as a discount brokerage, we know that that violated their financial model. But these are examples of not everybody out there is looking to compete or engage in good faith. And so in order to echo Rob's plea, all of our other pleas, it does you no good to complain on any internet platform about how difficult this is or that kind of thing. Now, constructive question, great. You know, if you're there engaging in some sort of way to actually get some clarity or whatever. But as Mark said earlier, I think you'll find the answers, the preparation, and the knowledge about what is happening in this particular legal environment is right here in our brokerage. You don't need to find it someplace else, right? Right here in the brokerage. And if you're working with a really good agent that's really frustrated with their brokerage because they're not having this kind of training, maybe introduce them to Angie. Bring them on over. Let's have a lunch or two and see and show them kind of what kind of support and things they can get here. But the internet is forever, folks. If it's deleted, doesn't mean it's deleted. So just remember that.
Well said, Joe. Thank you so much for that. Mike, did I see anything else come in while we're?
Yeah, it's just a couple. We'll round out today's meeting. Bettina says, very grateful to you all. I keep telling on people it's all about consumer clarity. Very, very true.
Exactly.
Sandy says, if the buyer broker compensation is addressed in the REPSI, do we need to add any other addendum to our listing under contract when we submit the dot loop? I think what you're saying is we're the listing agents here. And so in your scenario, you're the listing agent and they submitted an offer and just filled out 4.3. Is that what you're saying, Sandy? And your question is, do we need to do anything else? Is that correct?
She actually just had a client come in to meet with her, so she had to hop off.
Oh, well, I mean, as I understand it, no. As I understand the question, there's no additional documentation that would be submitted in the loop for that scenario.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
for the Rep C, if the commission is in 4.3, then we don't need to have that Rep C addendum to clarify those, to make sure the buyer's brokerage is going to supply the title what that commission is. Because do we want on
Yeah, I see. If you receive it just with the 4.3E and no addendum, yes. I would counter as the listing side, so everybody understands the question. If we're on the list side, we receive a Rep C that simply has 4.3E filled out and just says seller agrees to pay the buyer's brokerage, let's say 3%. And the seller's okay with that. But we should counter that offer, assuming the rest of the offer is fine. We should still counter that offer with our real estate brokerage compensation addendum, because on behalf of our seller, that requires the buyer to make the representation that they have a BBA that substantiates or confirms that 3% that they're asking for in the REPSI. And it contains the agreement of the buyer to deliver their BBA to the title company.
Right.
So sorry, I was misunderstanding the question. Yes, if we're on the list side, we would want to ask for a counter and ask for this real estate brokerage payment addendum.
Mark, what if they already accepted it? Then could she still send that over?
Yes, you could send it over as you'd send it over as an addendum.
And it's an addendum. Thank you.
Yeah, because it has, that's why it has an addendum and counter offer. That in that scenario, it would be an addendum.
The only thing they're adding is the commitment to deliver it to the title company.
Yeah, they're not really adding much. Well, they're adding something very significant, I should say.
Yeah.
they're not. It's not a huge ask, I should say, of the buyer.
All right, it is 1:57. Looks like the chat is cleared up, and there are no more additional questions.
Well, we will continue this. So as with the anecdotal stories continue, and as we get more experience with buyers and sellers and offers, we'll continue this each Thursday and more as needed. So trainings are going to keep coming. So stay tuned. Thank you all for joining.